welcome back to the final, not to say the last but not least, the final session of the 2022 edition of the OECD Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. And this year we have been addressing the issue of green innovation in the time of crises, such as coming out of the pandemic and also the war in Ukraine. So in this final session, a new push for hydrogen, we have a lineup of excellent panelists, and I have the pleasure of introducing the important person who's going to moderate this session, Noé van Holst. I would like to say Ambassador van Holst, because he used to be the ambassador to OECD a few years ago, so I remember these good old days. But now he's the chair of International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy. So over to you, Noé. The rest of yours.
Thank you so much, Kumi, for that kind introduction. Indeed, nice to be back at OECD. Not much has changed. I see in that sense that the last sessions are always the most challenging ones. But of course, a very warm welcome to everybody who stayed until the end of this forum, because the last session, of course, is going to be best. And we have many people also joining us, I heard, online. So I hope that all of you are still with us, and you are welcome to send in your questions once we get underway. So, why is this a very good session, ladies and gentlemen? Because hydrogen is really kind of the talk of the town. I mean, it's a very hot topic, as you will hear and you will discover. And if you don't believe it, then look at what happened in the last COP meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. How many meetings and how many announcements there were on particularly green hydrogen. It's unbelievable. I mean, I have myself, although I'm supposed to keep track of everything, I cannot keep track of it anymore. So I'm happy that many other people are doing that now also. And we will now discover, and we will of course discuss with all of our very good panelists, expert panelists, why that is the case. But Sharm el-Sheikh, I think, was a good testimony to how hot the topic of hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen, has become. And since the topic is also of this forum, what is the impact of shocks and of economic shocks, I think indeed the connection to was there a change after the war in Ukraine, I think is important to bear in mind, and I'm sure that many of the panelists will touch on that, whether that helped to give this new push on hydrogen or whether it has slowed us down. We will get the answer to that, I think, in this panel. From my perspective, and then I'll shut up and really move to our panelists. From my perspective, it is really critical what is going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. Why do I say that? Because you see so many beautiful, and I don't want to take anything away from that, but very important and very enlightening studies of, oh, hydrogen can be, 20% of the energy mix in 2050, or 25%, or maybe a bit less. And it's all very, 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 very fantastic and very challenging, but 2050 is very far away. Of course, it's not far away if you look at it from the perspective of the climate, but it is so far away that it's very hard to pin down, what are the chances that this is going to happen, yes or no. But the next 10 or 15 years will show us, is the world really going to succeed in scaling up this promising new technology, yes or no? Next 10 or 15 years. And if we don't succeed then forget about, that we're going to be very big, that hydrogen is going to be very big in 2050. If we do succeed, then yes, maybe we'll also push it through in the next decades. All right, I'll shut up now, and I will move to what is really our keynote presentation of Timur Gul of the IEA, and he is leading really the work on hydrogen at the IEA, and the Global Hydrogen Review is what some people like to call the North Star of the hydrogen publications for industry as well as for government. Timur, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, I should say, or Mr. Ambassador, or Noe. There's many things, many ways to address you here. Thanks also to our colleagues from the OECD for inviting me to speak here today. As Noe said, my name is Timo Gül. I'm the head of the Technology Division, Energy Technology Policy Division at the IEA, so in charge of hydrogen and everything that deals with innovation in the energy technology space at the IEA. So very big pleasure to be here in this GGSD forum and in this session on a new push for hydrogen, to talk a bit, to set the scene a bit by presenting you a couple of those latest insights that we just recently published by the end of September, I believe, in the context of our global hydrogen review. But as Noe just said, everything I'm telling you might be outdated in a few months of time, because really the push for hydrogen is quite enormous. I remember very well how we were actually for the Japanese G20 presidency in 2019 putting together a report on the future of hydrogen, where we tried to explain that momentum that we're seeing in hydrogen. And it was not particularly easy to, I mean, we are a number-oriented organization, and we are trying to show evidence by numbers, and it was not easy to do that. I must admit, I can admit that now. I could not admit that at the time. But now I think what has changed over the last 2-3 years, many countries putting forward their national strategies to increase hydrogen production and use. Obviously, the global energy crisis sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is adding to that, pushing very much in the direction of green hydrogen, low-emission hydrogen more broadly, partly not only to address climate change here, but also to deal with energy crisis, in particular here in Europe. So what I'd like to present is a bit an understanding of just how large is the project pipeline, what we are currently seeing actually happening on the ground, and where we are seeing a need to make further progress. Now, the point of departure in many ways is hydrogen is not new. I mean, we're calling it here a new push for hydrogen, but hydrogen, we are typically, when we're talking about this new push, this is not about hydrogen being a new energy vector or a new vector in the energy system. Hydrogen is there, it's produced and it's demanded. Roughly 94 million tons of hydrogen were produced and consumed in 2021, a new historic high, in fact, above the level that we've seen before the pandemic. It is hydrogen that is basically produced for the use in the refineries and for the use in the chemical industry, notably in fertilizer production. Very little is today produced or used in those promising applications that we are thinking of for the future cleaner, sustainable energy system at net zero emissions, such as in steel making or in specific areas of the transport sector, long distance transport in particular. Very little is currently being used there. And it's unfortunately hydrogen that is not produced, that's not green. It's not blue either. It is in fact produced from unabated fossil fuels, meaning natural gas steam reforming and coal gasification. Virtually no benefit for mitigating climate change, and no benefit really for enhancing energy security at this point in time either. The production of low emission hydrogen was just, out of those 94 million ton, was just 1 million ton, roughly less than 1 million ton in fact in 2021, practically all of it coming from fossil fuels with carbon capture, utilization and storage. Now, after all this daunting news, where's the good news? No, why are we talking about a new push here? The good news is that the pipeline of projects is really growing at an incredibly impressive speed. When we produced our report back in 2019, we put together a list of projects. It was a meaningful list of projects, but it was not particularly comprehensive. Today, when you're looking at the project pipeline that we are tracking, then you find that if all announced projects currently under development are realized, then your annual production of low emission hydrogen could reach up to 24 million ton just by the year 2030. This is not our scenario or our projections or anything or our expectation. This is just about the announced projects. about 14 million tons from electrolyzer waste and up to 10 million tons on fossil fuels with CCS associated with it. Very impressive figures. It's equivalent to 70% of the annual low emission hydrogen production that is actually needed in order to meet government targets for achieving their climate pledges. So it's a meaningful number, it's very significant moving forward. For electrolysis alone, the realization of all projects currently in the pipeline could lead to an electrolyzer capacity installed in between 134 and 240 gigawatt by the year 2030. And just again, to put things in perspective, we are currently somewhere around, Noe, correct me if I'm wrong, 500 megawatt is the amount, the installed electrolyzer capacity, and that's a huge increase from where we were just 3 years ago, where we are in a couple of 10 megawatt installed capacity. These are, of course, very encouraging signs of progress, but there are still very important challenges ahead. When I'm talking about planned projects, I don't mean these are projects that we can consider up and running as of tomorrow. There is still a lot of work that has to be done. A significant part of the projects that are currently at advanced planning stage, but only around 4% are either under construction already today or have reached a final investment decision. Only 44% of that project pipeline is actually materializing through a final investment decision or construction. This is quite slow progress compared with what the project pipeline actually would suggest. It's a consequence of uncertainties. Uncertainty is about demand, which makes it difficult to secure off-takers. It's uncertainty about clarity in regulatory frameworks and a lack of infrastructure, of course, to deliver hydrogen to end users. Nonetheless, I would still like to underscore that this progress is a very important part of what we as the IEA have been framing as a new energy economy that we believe is actually emerging. Following renewables and the significant growth that we have seen over the last 10 years, following electric vehicles, there's now electrolyzers in particular that show a significant investment opportunity moving forward. If you think about indicators here, one important indicator that you can think of this new energy economy that is emerging is actually capacity to manufacture these electrolyzers. Today, electrolyzer manufacturing capacity is around 8 gigawatt per year, so we are in a significant overcapacity in terms of what relative to the projects that are currently at early stage of development. This 8 gigawatts is already nearly twice the capacity that was available by the end of last year. Also, this is growing very, very rapidly. And when you look at industry announcements, this manufacturing capacity could grow sixfold by 2025 alone and exceed 60 gigawatt by the year 2030. In other words, an important industrial opportunity. You see here where this manufacturing capacity is currently being planned. This is by and large China and Europe, which are expected to remain the leaders in the sector, again, not based on our projection, but again, based on company announcements, accounting for roughly 2/3 of expected manufacturing capacity, but around 1/4 of these capacity announcements have not identified a location as yet for the manufacturing sites. They can be, of course, expected to be close to the main demand sites, and so with the provisions of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, it is well possible that a significant fraction of this yet to be determined part here may actually be deployed in the United States. But this is just my guess. I'm not saying this will happen this way, but that is a possible way forward. As a final way to introduce today's session, I would like to just talk a bit about the trade of hydrogen and its derivatives. It's one that is attracting a growing interest, not least in the context of Europe and not least in the context of the global energy crisis. Japan and Australia have been spearheading efforts here on this front, with the world's first shipment of liquefied hydrogen from Australia to Japan taking place in February this year. The current energy crisis and its implications for energy security mean that many countries are stepping up their efforts. Today, trade of hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels is very limited. No, these are demonstration projects that we're talking about today. It's limited to a few tons in sporadic shipments from those demonstration projects that we have. But when you look at the export-oriented projects that are currently under development, our current estimate is that 12 million tons of hydrogen, either in the form of hydrogen, pure hydrogen, or as hydrogen-derived fuels such as ammonia, could be exported annually by 2030. The first projects are actually aiming to come online as early as next year. Whether or not these exports are realized is, of course, highly uncertain. There are technical issues involved. There are other regulatory questions involved. The majority of these projects are at very early stages of development. An important challenge here is to actually secure customers. Offtake and importing agreements are lagging behind the scale of planned exports at this point in time. Only 2 million tons of hydrogen have secured a customer or potential off-taker. Another 2.5 million tons have identified a specific region or export, but without any off-take agreements. The uncertainties here are standards, regulations, certification, lack of infrastructure, and of course, the need to clarify how trade rules can apply to hydrogen and its derivatives. I'd leave it here. Thank you very much for the attention and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Timur, for that introduction, showing some highlights from the global hydrogen review. Maybe just as a quick follow-up question, if you have a kind of this overview of what is happening and what in that indeed that very promising pipeline of projects is, and yeah, the uncertainties around that. If you would have to pick one or two factors that, I'm sure governments are asking you all the time. Your IEA is in very high demand. We know the whole world is asking G7 government leaders. What do we need to do? What do we need to fix to to accelerate and to really make that new push possible? Which factors would you come up with?
It's a very good question, and obviously there are many things to fix in an environment that is about new technologies. It's a new market that is being established, but in many ways what you're looking for is to establish the rules of the game a bit. So game meaning the rules of the market. So sorry for being a bit sloppy in the language here, but I think this is what is dearly needed. How do you actually define low emission hydrogen? I mean, it's good to deal with colors, green, blue, whatever. There are many colors that are currently out there, but you need to know what are the emission thresholds, for example. You need to know how standard certification schemes are developing. These kind of things, to my mind, for establishing a market to secure arrangements between producers and consumers of hydrogen, both domestically but also internationally, is probably the one thing that I would think is key and is a key priority in my view for governments at this point. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure we will get back to that, and we'll draw in, of course, our other panelists now on this topic and also on other topics. We are very fortunate to have a panel where we heard just from the IEA, who looks at it from the global perspective and analyzes, what's going on. We have the global context now a bit clearer now in our minds, but we are very lucky that we have in the panel experts from different countries, so we can really dive in, on what's cooking there and what's happening in those countries. Now, Ohira-san, if I can turn to you from our expert from Japan. Japan has been, and we should all kind of really praise that, has been very, very early in the game of hydrogen and really showing global leadership in putting this on the agenda, organizing the first hydrogen ministerial meeting, which was, well, for everyone really an eye-opener.
of what's going on. You had the first hydrogen strategy. Can you elaborate a bit on where is Japan, how has Japan developed since then, and also again relating back to this key theme of this forum of did the shock or did the war in Ukraine, did that change anything? Did it accelerate things for you, or how do you see that?
Thank you. Thank you, Noé. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. This is quite important meeting. And the first time to attend to enter the OECD, obviously, it's kind of it's very proud of me. But anyway, well, and so let me talk about kind of a story in Japan. I was assigned this position almost 10 years ago, in 2013. At that time, and a lot of the people were skeptical about the hydrogen. But I would say that the situation is going to change dramatically. Now, and so the dozens of countries have the national hydrogen strategies. And many countries are committed to allocate a huge amount of budget to in this field. It's a good surprising for me. Well, anyway, and we Japan have a long history about the hydrogen. We started the national program around the 1970s. Well, and as you mentioned that we have the hydrogen strategy in the 2017, a little bit old. Our strategy there must be revised under the current to carbon neutral situation. Maybe the new strategy new roadmap may to open by the end of next month, something like that. Well, and we have the current. So I talked about the current Japan roadmap. Well, and we have the roadmap, and toward 2050, our challenge is to reducing hydrogen costs and our develop the enhanced hydrogen demand in 2030 and 2050. Well, I would say there's many actions because covered by the hydrogen is very wide. And we have many action, hydrogen production, utilization, transportation, etc. But I would say I stress that 2030 it's a very important year for Japan because in 2030 we must start hydrogen power generation, and it's a huge hydrogen cause a huge hydrogen demand. And we start hydrogen import in 2030. We also started domestic renewable hydrogen in 2030. We have just 8 years to the important year to 2030. We need to accelerate R&D activity. This is my role to accelerate R&D activity. Well, and we are working for to hydrogen production, storage, transportation, utilization. But I would say that we have just two keywords to accelerate hydrogen activities. One is scaling up. And we're working for the scaling activity. And to say that we already successful our first liquefied hydrogen small tanker and journey between Japan and Australia and successfully. But we need to we would like to scaling up this liquefied hydrogen tanker maybe 100 times the bigger hydrogen capacity in 5 years. We also are working for the hydrogen power generation. We now already succeed for 1 megawatt per hydrogen gas turbine system, but we'd like to scaling up in several hundred crores and also in the 5 years. We also are scaling up in water electrolysis also. Also Japan also working for to enhance the fuel cell application. And one is the commercial vehicle for long heavy duty vehicle or small medium duty vehicle for as a commercial vehicle to develop the new large hydrogen demand. We also are working collaborate with the Port of Los Angeles to develop the new application for hydrogen application at port, like a top handler, gantry crane, and the edge rocket. And the other keyword is integration. How to integrate the hydrogen into the current energy systems. We now conducting several projects with developing a low regional hydrogen energy system. It's like a hydrogen valley in Europe. We now collaborate with the Japanese local government to develop the kind of regional hydrogen energy systems. This is our current activities.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you for that quick overview of so many things happening since 2017. But just as a quick follow-up, could you dive a little bit deeper on what's kind of the experience? What did you learn in terms of, you know, since 2017 you had your targets, and now, you know, you started the pilots, etc. Now you're 5 years. We're 5 years later. What kind of experience did it? You know, is it going better or faster than you expected, or actually have a lot of barriers to overcome?
Well, so many barriers in front of us, because it's a long journey to realize in the hydrogen society. But we understand that how to involve, how to enhance our friends or kind of the stakeholders. Well, and the first of all, only a few companies working this area, but we need to expand, especially to users or demand side. Well, and yes, we believe that hydrogen production is quite important, but we also need a huge amount of hydrogen demand or commitment. In Japan case, we invited the power sectors, electric company, that they kindly commit to use the hydrogen to power generation. That's why we conducted several projects. Again, so we learn a lot of things through our demonstration or R&D project, but most of all, we need to invite and enhance the stakeholders. That's quite important.
Thank you, Ohira-san. I think that's an important point for I think for all of us to take into account. I think the learning from Japan there of you know, which started out, you know, very much from a supply side kind of perspective, and then discovering that, you know, you need to actually also, Timo already mentioned that, you know, the demand side is so important. How do you secure that there's really offtake? Otherwise, you know, you run into trouble in, you know, for the whole value chain. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to that. But as I said, we are very lucky. We have this panel with many perspectives from different countries of the world. And by the way, Japan, of course, is also very interesting because it's a country that sees itself as going to be importing a large scale low emission hydrogen from other countries. And one of those countries actually might be Chile. But I'm already preempting what we will hear from our colleague who is online, Angel. You can hear us, I hope. You are online from Chile, from the ministry, and you're gonna. Maybe you can comment indeed on the Chilean perspective of how you are looking from Chile. Your perspective of developing hydrogen, and what is key for you, because we all know Chile as, you know, the powerhouse in copper and a big exporter in copper, but it might you might add some new things to that. I understand. Please, can you comment on what how you see where Chile is going with hydrogen?
You're right. First of all, I'm so glad to be at least virtually from Chile with such an interesting panelist and audience. It's a real honor to me be here. And thank you for the invitation. Well, as you know, Chile is committed to become carbon neutral by 2050, and green hydrogen will play a crucial role in achieving this target. Our projections show that in Chile, green hydrogen we could contribute around 25% of the required emission reduction up until mid-century. So recognizing this opportunity, this government also believes in the promotion of local development with a social and inclusive perspective. This is why the assessment of economic, social, cultural, and also environmental impacts are of foremost importance for a successful green hydrogen rollout. With these challenges in mind, the government of President Boric has created an interministerial committee led by the Ministry of Energy, which in close collaboration with the Chilean Economic Development Agency and other ministries, such as the Foreign Affairs, Industry, Finance, Science and Technology, the Environment and Transport, among many others, we are all working together for a sustainable deployment of green hydrogen, creating a new clean industry for Chile with a systemic approach. Some of the challenges of this committee are as follows. First of all, the growth of internal demand, which has to rise from the current 52,000 tons per year to a potential of 5 million tons by 2050, which will represent a bit more than 1% of the expected world demand. Secondly, the creation of new economic activities and the growth of local value all along the production chain, which will be enabled through fostering domestic providers of products and services through the creation of high-value local employment, technology transfer, and also research and development. Third, local development, which is at the core of this new industry's creation process. It must be harmonic and respectful of the environment, must be just in regard in the insertion of the industry in the local communities, and must be balanced as for the public goods and its distribution. And lastly, the strengthening of the export capacity. By 2050, at least 30% of the global green hydrogen production will be imported by the main centers of consumptions, such as the European Union and also Japan, for example, and it will be done to cover their own domestic demands. On the other hand, we are a blessed country with a huge amount of renewable energies potential. This is an immense opportunity for Chile and its economy, and international collaboration is really essential for accelerating the competitiveness of green hydrogen worldwide. That is why we are promoting and strengthening agreements and partnerships with a number of countries, key ports, and also international organizations, providing a robust framework from the transition toward a greener future and getting ready to export green molecules way before in advance than 2050. Allow me to conclude by saying that the public-private partnerships should be our common ground and the starting point to raise the ambition of climate actions from all its angles. Let's work together to strengthen this relation for a better future, not only for us, but especially for the generations to come. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Angel, for this overview of the thinking now, the recent thinking in Chile, because as many people will know, Chile also recently had a new government, but this is obviously also the view from the new government as expressed by Angel. Meaning that a lot of emphasis, of course, on how hydrogen can help decarbonization in Chile itself, in the local communities, also the local economy, but also still at the same time, because you have this huge potential of renewable, indeed, also eyeballing exports. Could you enlighten us a little bit more, Angel, on, because you say yes, but that's also going to come before 2050. But as I said in my introduction, 2050 is, for some people still far away. Could you give us a best guess of when will we see, even if small, kind of the first shipments of green hydrogen from Chile coming to Japan or Europe or other places? Could you give us a guess of that?
Yeah, we are strongly working to have our first exportation of green hydrogen or even ammonia by around 2030. So we are working in the regulation. We are working also to develop a common infrastructure. We are also working in the infrastructure of the ports and so forth. So our expectations are by 2030 to have the first ships going to Japan or the European Union.
Sorry, just to be very clear, you said 2050?
2030.
2030.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Just maybe the transmission, or maybe I'm half deaf, is also possible, according to my wife at least. 2030. Okay, that's great. Good. Very good to know. And as you said, you mentioned ammonia indeed, because as for those who do not know, ammonia can be one of the ways to one carrier to transport hydrogen. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and please stay online. We may circle back to you if possible, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now turning to back to our live panel here, and we're very lucky to have with us Christelle, qui va parler en français.
Who's going to speak French. And that's also very good. Christelle, I would like to ask you about the hydrogen strategy in France, because France has also been very active for a long time. It launched a hydrogen strategy early on, I think maybe a bit later than Japan, but not that much later, I think. So could you explain to us how it works, and now with the implementation of hydrogen strategy in France, and above all in relation to what we're also trying to do in Europe, because in Europe as well, the European Union has its own hydrogen strategy. So maybe you can explain to us what it's all about. Thank you, Noé. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, indeed, I'm going to speak French, but I can also understand questions in English, so don't hesitate. I'll try to give you a fairly quick overview of what's going on in France and Europe. Well, first of all, in France, to be quite honest, I'll speak on behalf of France Hydrogène, which is a professional association bringing together all the players in the value chain. I'm not representing the French government. However, of course, we've worked hand in glove with the French government to draft the French hydrogen strategy. There was a first one in 2018, and then indeed a more fleshed out strategy that takes into account the upstream from production to uses. It was published by the French government in September 2020. And there were three main areas in it. The first one was to decarbonize industrial uses, as Mr. Gill said, refineries, fertilizers, chemicals, and with the deployment of manufacturing industrial capacity for electrolysis. So the French strategy, which was collected, was to have major electrolysis capacity in France to decarbonize 680,000 tons of hydrogen by 2030 in industry, but also in new industrial uses. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Steel, for instance, steel production, but also in mobility. What we are seeing in terms of mobility in France is that hydrogen might be used to decarbonize everything that's difficult to be electrified directly, so it's quite complementary with electric mobility, which is on the rise now with batteries. But for instance, for professional intensive mobility that needs to recharge quickly, or that needs a long range, or that needs to transport heavy loads, well, hydrogen may play that role. And the heavier the mobility, the more hydrogen will fit in. So we're also thinking about hydrogen for lorries, trucks, but also for ships, aircraft, and also trains. And the third area in the French strategy was to carry on with our efforts in research and innovation, and also to think about skills challenges, and the adaptation of jobs, existing jobs, to hydrogens, and also to focus on training so that in France we would have available labor to deploy hydrogen on the territory.
I'd just like to add a comment before I go on to the European strategy, because the European strategy is ambitious. It came out in July 2020, and they're talking about 1 million tons of hydrogen by 2024, 2 million by 2030. This is for consumption, and part of that is imported. And the EU really focused on green hydrogen. And I'd like to pick up on what Timo said earlier. In France, we want to drop the color codes. They're a bit of a trap. Okay, green is good, and then you've got blue, pink, yellow, grey, brown, whatever. And so what we're saying, as Timo said, we want to see how we can decarbonize quickly, how we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions quickly in the different sectors with net zero for 2050. So low carbon or no carbon or renewable hydrogen makes sense. And when we say low carbon, it doesn't matter how it's produced. It can be with natural gas capturing the CO2, or through electrolysis, or by biomass thermolysis. There are different ways, but once you've reached a threshold for CO2 emissions related to the production of hydrogen, which is a respectable level, and that's on the basis of the European taxonomy, it's 3 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of hydrogen produced. I'm not going to go into the subtleties of that, but you can go up to 3.38 kilos of CO2 for equivalent per kilo produced. So as long as you can get to that threshold, then it's considered to be the carbon neutral. And I think we can look at all the subtleties for calculating CO2 emissions and the whole carbon methodology. We can go into that. But before we go into that, we can say that in France we're in line with the European strategy for deployment of hydrogen, and obviously for renewable and carbon neutral. And what we want to have in France is our own production facilities for hydrogen, for what's needed in France for the local ecosystems, whereas the European Union sees the need to import some on the basis that we can't produce everything in Europe. So Europe originally said it was 10 million tons that was needed, and with the war in Ukraine, we're now saying 20 million tons. And of the 20 million tons, half of that has to be imported from outside the EU. So, well, of course, we can discuss this. This works out how you're going to import the hydrogen. There are countries outside the EU that can import it or export it, and then how we're going to deal with hydrogen as a commodity in international trade, because the general opinion is that hydrogen is going to be a key player in the energy mix. Some talk about 15% or around 15% in the energy mix.
Christelle, for that great overview of both the French strategy as well as the European strategy, and also this takeaway indeed that like already was mentioned by Timur, which I think is relevant for all of us, that indeed it's kind of the public debate always is about green and blue and etc. But that's fantastic for a nice newspaper article, but in practice, of course, yeah, we need to talk about really, you know, where does this help really the decarbonization, yes or no? And then you're talking about, indeed, is it low carbon or not, and does it help? So we need to move from the discussion about colors basically to discussion about, you know, what kind of threshold do we need, of what kind of ceiling do you want as a maximum of carbon footprint of that hydrogen production, however it is produced. And of course, moving away then from fossil fuel-based hydrogen production, as is now still by majority the case. As a follow-up question, maybe to you, Christelle, maybe twofold. I think number one, although you do stress indeed that the French approach is very much in line with the European approach, yet at the same time it seems that there are also quite some significant differences between France stressing very much European production and European kind of regional approach of tackling the clusters, to, for instance, what Germany and also Belgium and the Netherlands are doing, more also about talking about infrastructure, European infrastructure, and including significant imports to that mix. Are you worried about that? How do you view this kind of lack of alignment, or whatever you want to call it? Maybe I'm exaggerating, but how do you view that also from the French industry perspective? That would be my first follow-up question. My second follow-up question would be, people talk a lot now in Europe about the US Inflation Reduction Act. And okay, it's called Inflation Reduction Act, but for those of you who do not know it, it has a huge tax incentives for clean energy production, basically. And for hydrogen production, for instance, the new US law means that you can get a subsidy in the US of up to $3 per kilogram of produced hydrogen from low carbon hydrogen or renewable hydrogen or whatever, which may attract a lot of investment from around the world. So while Europe is developing and is debating a lot, on aime parler, discuter en Europe. The US already put this law in action, and in the boardrooms they are looking, not at the debates, but they're looking at, what can I, where are the fiscal incentives? How worried are you as French industry organization also about that?
Alors, je vais essayer de répondre dans l'ordre.
Now I'll try and answer your questions in order, and I'll try to be brief. Now, for the first point, I don't think there's any direct opposition. It's a question of deployment in time. We talked about securing use and securing demand, and we're looking at that in France, but it's also the case in Europe, because when you look at European financing for the Clean Hydrogen Partnership, I could explain that to you later if you like, but there's a concept of an ecosystem. And in France, we also say we're going to be producing hydrogen in France, and that's to respond to needs which have been identified for consumption in France. Because if there's no uptake, then there's no point. We're going to find the sector in difficulty. So what we have in France, and this is not the opposite to what's happening in Europe, initially we're going to be producing where there is a catchment area for using hydrogen. And in France we have 7 main hydrogen areas. These are the European hydrogen valleys. And here we can pool different uses for industry and for mobility, and optimize a production site to lower production costs, hydrogen production costs.
Mutualiser.
So once you've pooled the uses and got them together, and once you have an ecosystem that's operational, then you can link the ecosystems up together. Well, they're already infrastructure for transportation and for hydrogen in these hydrogen valleys, as we call them. But in the second half of the century, we'll be linking the valleys up together, and then we'll get the consumption sites together on what we call the European hydrogen backbone. And it's a question of time. You see, it's a timeline. And in France, what we've often said is we're not opposed to imports. That's not what we're discussing. we're certainly in favor of having pipelines for hydrogen. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, obviously, but there were recently announcements made by the French president about a pipeline which would link Barcelona to Marseille. So there's no problem about that. It's a question of when the infrastructure will be there, and so we'll start producing and consuming in a given area. Perhaps the point of disagreement between France and Europe is that France, we want to produce hydrogen on the basis of the French electricity grid, which has a great advantage because it's already very low carbon, which is not the case in other countries, for example, in Germany. And until very recently, it was not a costly grid either. So we wanted to produce our hydrogen in France with electrolysis for the electricity grid, doing clean, low-carbon hydrogen. That was the plan in France, and this is not in conflict with what's being done in the European Union, because everybody can see that given the objectives that have been set of 20 million tonnes, with 10 million produced in France, in Europe rather, this means 550 terawatt hours of renewable electricity in addition to what we already have. So that's a huge amount. And nobody thinks we're going to be able to do that given the deployment of renewable energy in different countries in Europe and in France too. It's not moving ahead fast enough. So the idea is to have renewable hydrogen, but we still have to have the response to the needs as identified. So that's the answer to your first point. Now for your second point, we looked at announcements made in the United States in August with the Inflation Reduction Act. That was a great interest to us, and we can see that it's a game changer, and we can see that the United States has moved ahead with rules which our industry sees as simple and usable, whereas in Europe we've been having discussions for quite some time now. How can we consider whether the hydrogen produced is renewable? What will the rules be to describe it as renewable, and what carbon criteria will be applied to that? But I think that's part and parcel of the European Union. We spend time here. But obviously we realize we have to step things up and accelerate very quickly, because we won't be able to do this if the framework is not clear. And in France, there's a mechanism that will be implemented so that we can offset the production costs between fossil-based hydrogen as it's produced today and low-carbon renewable hydrogen. So there'll be a similar mechanism set up in France as of 2023.
For those explanations, that clarifies, I think, a lot, and we may circle back to some of those points later on, but not before we also have our last panelists here who, thank you so much, Antoine, for stepping in at the late moment. We know when you woke up this morning, I think you didn't know you were going to sit on this panel, but he is replacing Marco Alvera, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but still we are very happy to have you here, Antoine, with your tremendous expert knowledge and on a broader level, but nevertheless extremely relevant. So we will be very happy to hear your kind of reflections on what you have heard about where hydrogen is going, where people think hydrogen is going, and what are your reflections on that, please?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for inviting me at the last minute. I'm not sure I'm actually replacing Marco, because Marco was a true hydrogen expert, which I am not. I'm more of a green innovation policy expert. But nevertheless, it's great to be here because, I'm a bit of an outsider on this panel, and it will allow me to be a bit provocative, I guess. So that's the advantage. Let me reflect a bit on what I just heard. So, I see all these targets that governments have set themselves, that, Timur presented in his graph, year by year. And I see, targets in terms of deployment, gigawatt hours of electrolyzers. I see targets in terms of production of, million tons of hydrogen. But then I think about, yesterday's, we had a session on mission innovation, mission strategies. And I'm asking myself, what is the mission there? What should be the target? And to me, just like with any, low carbon technology, to me the target is the cost reduction. To me, the target should be to get, green hydrogen to be cost competitive with its, fossil fuel alternative. And we actually published a paper on innovation and industrial strategy for green hydrogen a few months ago. And we looked at countries' hydrogen strategies. And I think only 2 of them had, in their national strategy, an objective in terms of a target cost for producing hydrogen. I think it was Australia and the US, and the target was that it should be at $2 per kilogram of hydrogen by 2030. And to me, that is very meaningful, probably more meaningful than, targeting these millions of tons of hydrogen by 2030, because the question is at what cost? Christelle just mentioned this new policy instrument in France, and I think billions of euros have actually been budgeted for this instrument, to cover the cost difference. But that's, is it going to be sustainable in the long run? And to, next to it, there is a 100 million euro fund for R&D. So billions for already, covering cost differences in terms of deployment, much less to R&D. So, my first reaction is we should perhaps, talk a bit more about this, push for R&D, so directly supporting firms more to do the R&D that's necessary to reduce these costs, and these demonstration plants, which I think this is absolutely critical, and there's a lot of public money on this, I should say, that is being put there. Because if you look at the potential for cost reduction in hydrogen, basically there's 2 ways to reduce the cost. One is to improve the electrolyzers themselves, and I'm talking only of green hydrogen here. And the second is to reduce the cost of electricity itself, right? And it's about half if you look at the projections by various institutes that I looked online. And so basically, first point is, perhaps we need to focus more on R&D, reduce the cost, and then it will be time to have this. I mean, these targets, they might be useful because they reduce uncertainty. It's important to create the market, but that's the first point. And then we also need, as was said several times, to create this international market, because the second way you reduce cost is, of course, by scaling up, economies of scale. I mentioned the cost of electricity. We need to produce the hydrogen where it's cheapest to produce. The Australian desert is one example, okay? That means we need to then export it to other countries. And that's why I think, I see all of these national strategies, and actually perhaps, Noé, you could then talk a bit to this. I see also a need for much more harmonization and coordination across countries in terms of, setting these standards on the origin of hydrogen, on purity, content, and so on. Because without it, we won't be producing, creating this international market that we need to have a cheap green hydrogen. And it's probably a very difficult task. Because just defining what is low carbon hydrogen, if you have a solar farm or a wind farm producing electricity for an electrolyzer, that's, that could be considered as green hydrogen. But of course, the question also is, what is this electricity displacing? What could it have it been used for? And so if you're burning coal to produce electricity next door and using the renewable to produce the hydrogen, that of course doesn't work, because to me hydrogen is a bit, the marginal use of electricity. It shouldn't be the first one. So it seems very complicated. So if you could also perhaps say a few words about what's going on at the IP, what is the name, IPHE, in terms of harmonizing these standards, that would be great. And infrastructure is, I think, also absolutely critical. To in particular, these pipelines across Europe, for example. Christelle, perhaps you know a bit about this. In this IEA report, there was this interesting figure that there's 3 million kilometers of natural gas pipelines across the world, 5,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines. It's like 1 in 1,000. So and this again, I mean, I see some infrastructure plan in the national strategies, but not a lot across countries, which is key for this international market. So, voilà. So a couple of additional points to discuss. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Antoine. Seems like you're more of an expert than you pretend you are. Thank you very much. No, I think there's some excellent points, and let's try to pick up on some of those, but maybe like one by one and not all at the same time. Because they're all kind of they're all related, of course, as always, but they're also distinct and valuable enough to kind of look at them one by one. I mean, first, your first point was about the cost. I think that's a very interesting one. Maybe I can then, kind of circle back all the way to IEA and to Timor, because of course IEA is a super expert in looking at the cost and looking at the potential for cost reductions, and also looking at indeed comparing hydrogen also in the portfolio of clean energy technologies for several applications, etc. Could you comment a bit on this question indeed about cost, Timor, from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Noe, and all good points. So where to start and where to finish? So I think we need to keep a few things apart here. Electrolyzers will continue to need R&D without any question. But it's a technology that is ready for the market. So it is a technology that will benefit from production and from scale in terms of bringing down the cost. Today, hydrogen production through electrolyzers, whatever the electricity that you're putting in, is not particularly cheap. It will not be the most cheap fuel in the future either, even if all the cost reduction targets are being met. Just to give you a rough sense, is a factor of 8 when it comes to, or $1 per kilogram of hydrogen is roughly $8 per MBTU. No? So in order to put things in a perspective, we are currently probably somewhere, I mean, it depends on the region very much, but we're probably a factor of 4 to 6 higher when it comes to renewable hydrogen production, but these costs will come down. And the reason is the project pipeline that I've been showing. No, these are not necessarily government aspirations here. I agree very much with the point, of course, on the European, there are important European targets, but here what we've been collecting for our report is, in fact, projects that are under development, that have been announced by companies that want to invest in the hydrogen space. If all this materializes, we will come down with the cost very much. And I think it is very important indeed, as you said, that a cost objective is being kept in mind. No, we can't just. It's a matter of how you define, or it's an important input to how we define the policies that the subsidies or whatever kind of policies that we are putting in place in order to bring hydrogen produced from electrolyzers into the market. So it's a very important piece for the policy equation here, that we know where we want to go in terms of the costs, and we know where we are today. But I do believe that with all that is happening in the electrolyzer space, with the increase in manufacturing capacity that we see, with the companies being ready to deploy those companies that are ready to deploy these electrolyzers, that we're going to be seeing significant cost reduction here. And Antoine said one thing in the passing that I think is critically important, is the additionality issue here. No? That indeed renewable electricity should not be used to produce hydrogen, and then all of a sudden we don't have that renewable electricity for electricity purposes available. So how to ensure these kind of projects are actually, these green hydrogen projects, as we would call them now, are actually additional is another important policy challenge that I'd be seeing at this point.
Christelle, I have the sense that you want to jump in as well. Sauter.
Je vais sauter.
Okay, jump. Yes, I wanted to echo what's been said and make a few comments. As far as the manufacturing cost, indeed, there's going to be a scaling up of the production capacity, and there is this common project which allows to identify electrolyzing projects, and they're going to reduce the cost of electrolyzers by 4. Today, if we take alkaline system, we're going to have 1,000. We're going to move from 1,000 to 500, and there's going to be a build-up of the production in order to produce 17 gigawatt of electrolyzing capability per year. So we also have to think about the cost of the molecule, and what the problem is what remains. That is the functioning of the electrolyzer, which depends on the loading factor, and which depends on the cost of the associated electricity. And that's the true problem, because we talked about additionality, okay, but what we have to look is how can we guarantee access to primary energy source, that is electricity, which has a reasonable cost. And today this is a real question. And access to electricity in order to manufacture electrolyzers, hydrogen, is a real question. And we're looking at long-term procurement contract or other systems which could solve that difficulty. Thank you very much, Diskep.
Yes, and there's many aspects about reducing cost. And one of the nice things to say that it's a scaling up. It's reducing the cost aspect. Other one is using the unused energies. Well, and we are collaborate with the Australian government to use the brown coal to produce the hydrogen. But brown coal itself, it cannot be exported easily, because that's kind of the unused energies, and should be providing the low cost and hydrogen. But also for thinking about the renewables, excess electricity, also it's kind of the unused energies. It's going to be a point to using the unused energies. But reducing the cost of the electrolysis, we need to working for the R&D to reduce the cost of not only capex but also the opex. We need to reduce the maintenance costs. We need to identify what breakdown of the maintenance, and once identify the breakdown of the maintenance, we need to tackle one by one to reduce the maintenance costs.
Thank you. I think that was very, very useful round with the panelists about this cost issue. Antoine, I think Timur made I think this point already also a bit. In a way, and I think IEA has said that several times, that basically hydrogen, or a low carbon hydrogen, or whatever you want to call it, is a bit where solar and wind energy were 10, 15 years ago, that before the real scaling up. Now everybody says, oh yeah, of course, no, it's so cheap, solar and wind is so cheap. Well, it wasn't cheap 10, 15 years ago when the scaling up really started and governments started pushing it. It wasn't cheap at all. And everybody's, even, if you would have to feed all the people that said at that time, you are crazy, you should never do that. I'm so old that I even, I had to sign the first license for the first wind offshore for farm in the Netherlands. And people were telling me, all the experts, you are completely nuts. You should never do that. It's never going to happen. It will never work. And I said, yeah, maybe you're right. But yeah, maybe we should also try it. Innovation is also, learning by doing, etc. Anyway, but the other point I want to make is, from my perspective, is that you know, we should also make fair comparisons, because if we talk about the cost and you compare it to fossil fuel alternatives for application, you know, yeah, that's kind of unfair because that's going out. I mean, this is unsustainable. So for all of these applications, I think we need to, you know, you need to make the comparison between low emission solutions. So the cost and bringing down the cost should be then, you know, compared to other low emission alternatives, because, yeah, I mean, diesel trucks, they're not going to be there in 2050, if at least, you know, if all the targets are going to be met. And so if the moment that cities or regions say that, you know, we don't want any, you know, we only want zero emission vehicles in our city or in our regions, I mean, the business case is done. You know? Those diesel trucks, I mean, are out, and the diesel buses are out, and you're only talking about, is it going to be electric, or is it going to be fuel cells, or is it going to be hydrogen, or whatever, you know? So governments can, I think that was also what Timur was trying to say, governments can shape those markets in a very, very important way, and basically solve, in a way, many of the cost issues in quite a strong way. But maybe because we are running out of time, as usual, you had so many other points. I don't know, you want to come back on this point, or you are satisfied with the responses that you got from the excellent responses from the panelists? I'm not talking about myself. But,
exactly. So that's exactly what I was. So I'm very satisfied, but could you say a couple of words on harmonization of standards?
Yes,
and
that
how
was your
you work
second
with
point. That was your second point.
It's
but
important.
I don't want to spend too much time on that. Yeah, certainly IPHE is one of the, not the only one, but one of the indeed organizations that tries to help shape the global market. Indeed, by for instance trying to develop a common methodology on how you actually calculate the carbon footprint of hydrogen production in different pathways, so that you know that if you have hydrogen coming from shipping from, you were mentioning Australia or from Chile, that we know that the way that they calculate the carbon footprint of that production is done in a similar way. So that's what we are trying to stimulate by indeed proposing common methodologies, which hopefully will lead to ISO standards at the global level, but that will take many years before that's the case. So that's one way to do it. But I mean, you're absolutely right. Of course, if we need a global marketplace, and that can help a lot in scaling up. Otherwise, we will get fragmented regional markets that, yeah, will slow us down in you know, going down the cost curve and going down the learning curve. Yeah. So if you allow us, because we have one question from we don't want to ignore our friends online. We have one question here of Alan, who is asking us, there's also the prospect of air travel using hydrogen. So airplanes on hydrogen. How likely is this to see the light? Of course it is possible. If possible, it would have a large impact on the carbon footprint. Anyone wants to comment on that? I go first, of course, to the intellectual powerhouse IEA. Timur.
Yeah, thank you, Noy. Always very kind. In fact, I don't know if I've been thinking about this all panel. I mean, because I was talking about the way I should address Noe here. And in fact, the way we address him is Mr. Hydrogen in the IEA, but this is how we call him internally, but which he is, in fact. Now, on hydrogen in aviation, I think obviously Airbus is investing into this very much. I think at this, and the targets, if I'm not mistaken, no, you correct me, is 2035, I think, for deployment. So I think we'll need to see where this technology is going. No, I mean, I think in terms of the range it might be reaching at this point in time, I'm not sure it will make for say cross-Atlantic flights. No, we'll have to see how this is playing out as a technology. But here, hydrogen can play many different play many different roles. It can help in a micro scale with onboard type of electricity uses or anything. And of course, there's the opportunity to produce hydrogen-derived fuels, synthetic fuels for aviation, where we, in fact, in our net zero by 2050 scenario and roadmap that we released last year, do see a role. Very much so. It could, as a fuel, if, of course, the carbon atom that you need in order to produce these synthetic fuels is derived in a climate-neutral type of fashion. Combined with hydrogen, you can expect synthetic fuels to. I mean, it becomes literally a drop-in fuel, very similar properties as kerosene. So we do see, in this kind of way, a very important role. Absolutely. Whether or not direct use of hydrogen on airplanes will play a role in the longer term for decarbonizing aviation is to be seen. But this is all about the innovation process. It's very hard to anticipate now. The technology development that we are supposed to be expecting over the next 10, 15 years or so.
Yes, thank you very much, Timur. Ohirazan?
Yes, and we very much respect the Airbus and approaches and realizing the hydrogen and aircraft by 2034. And also Japan, we are founding the Japan's heavy industry, heavy industry, working for the hydrogen engines and for the air aviation. And the technology is very close to the hydrogen gas turbine system. So, and based on that technology, they are directed to develop the to hydrogen aviation propulsion systems. And also, they are not only hydrogen, but other fuel like e-fuel, the synthetic fuel, or biofuel. That's the kind of talking in this morning, the option to the to carbon neutrality in aviation.
Oui, Christelle, please.
Just to complete, without repeating what was said very well, there is a European directive called Fuel EU Aviation, and which gives a few prospects on the use of synthetic fuel for decarbonization, because that's the key thing, is to decarbonize the various sectors, including aviation. This is perhaps a accelerator for the development of hydrogen for aircraft. Merci.
And indeed, as Alan, as you put in your question on indeed hydrogen for air travel, I think makes also the interesting point that what Christelle said before, and which I should have repeated, I wanted to, but I forgot, is that really you should look at hydrogen, not as this is the solution to all of our energy problems, but it is just one of the pillars, and particularly at the low carbon technology that can help us decarbonize sectors which are very hard to tackle in another way, tackle through simple electrification. Of course, if you can do simple electrification with wind and solar energy or nuclear, it's always easier and it's always faster. You don't have to be so, complicated to go through a route of producing hydrogen, But unfortunately, there are a number of sectors which are so damn difficult to electrify. And you're talking then about aviation, or you're talking about shipping, or you're talking about steel industry, refineries, chemical industry, etc. So that is the whole issue. So you should view it as, the complementarity from a total energy system approach. Angel, I see you are still online and we have been terribly ignoring you. I hope, can you give us your view from Chile maybe? Are you still there, Angel? Oh, yes, great, you're still there.
I'm still here.
I have been completely wrong in ignoring you because we had this little round of discussion on the cost and also on the issue of creating a global market and standardization. From your perspective, maybe you can comment on both those elements, because at some point somebody told me Chile thinks that they will be producing the cheapest green hydrogen in the world. I don't know whether this is still the idea and the ambition, but maybe you can comment both on the cost and also on the certification issue for global markets.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct, because we have a low price of the energy. So that is key for the levelized cost of hydrogen. But I would also to add that the role of the state is to give so much certainties, as Timur, I think, already said. Certainties in order to promote sustainable investment, but certainties not only to investors, but I also want to remember that it is important that people and the environment. So in this regard, Chile is working in accelerate the development of the hydrogen regulation. Today, we have established by law that the hydrogen is an energy carrier. So we, the Ministry of Energy, are the responsible for that regulation. Then we're working in a regulatory plan together with the industry. The first stage of this plan is related to the hydrogen quality standards, the blending, and also the safety. That is a key issue. Moreover, we want to become a green hydrogen exporter, as I said before. So we need to assure that the hydrogen we produce is really green, produced by renewable energy. This is why it's so important for us to have a stamp of its green hydrogen recognized worldwide. So that is the certification scheme is a key issue for us. So the Chilean government is currently working in a public-private partnership, defining the priorities of the regulation, where the certification also is one of the issues we are working on.
Okay, great, excellent. Thank you so much, Angel, for that. And I'm very glad you also mentioned the safety issue, because that is indeed something also that IPHE actually at the global level also tries to work on. Because certainly, if you talk about bringing hydrogen to new applications, like in transportation, or as some countries are doing even, for heating in houses, then this safety issue and respecting or having the highest safety standards possible is extremely important. Of course, in industry, like Timur was saying, they've been working with hydrogen, in refineries for decades. They know how to do it. They know how to have the safety standards, etc. But once you start bringing it to new sectors and new applications, and particularly also consumers, households, this is a completely new story. So you need to have, in pumps, in stations, or for instance, where you have hydrogen, have really the highest standards. And there will always be some problems or some incidents, and then you need to learn from that and exchange that internationally of, how do you do it better? How do you avoid it in the future? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great panel. However, even every excellent panel comes to an end. But not before I ask the question that OECD has insisted I should ask each of you, because that's kind of a standard in this forum apparently. What are the key knowledge gaps? What are the areas of future work for the OECD or for other organizations? Because we talked about many things, but what do we don't, what are the knowledge gaps? What do we not know? And what should we be pursuing as areas for future work as OECD, IEA, or others? Let me finish this time with Timur, because Timur is IEA and he has to, kind of harvest all of that, probably most of that. Let me start with can I start with you, Antoine? What do you think are some areas that people should be paying more attention to, knowledge gaps?
What I should be working on, you mean, because I'm at the OECD. So. To me, the question is, I like the point you made that, hydrogen is where solar or wind were, 10, 15 years ago. and we observe this, massive cost reduction, 90% in the last decade. That's, exactly what needs to happen as well. But the question is what is the kind of most efficient, optimal policy mix that we need to put in place for this to happen. And hence my, intervention about, the right balance between supporting R&D, demonstration projects, setting these targets. What's the, investment tax credits or production tax credit? What do we need exactly? I do not have the answer to this, but I think that if we could come up with this kind of, recipe, that would be extremely helpful for governments, because I observe large differences across countries in terms of the types of policies that they're putting in place, and achieving this at the least cost is of course the million-dollar question to me.
Okay, great, excellent. Thank you, Antoine. Ohira-san.
Well, that's a very difficult question. I don't want to cannot find the same gap, but this is the hydrogen. The hydrogen market is not developed yet. So many the government must take a leadership in this area. So many countries, as I mentioned, that many countries have to just own a roadmap and own strategy, and many experience that. We have the many opportunity to share our knowledge. So the many framework, like IPHA also, IEA, we have several hydrogen-related technology cooperation program in the IEA and the mission innovation, Korean Ministerial. I suppose we're going to share our knowledge through the cooperation between the framework. Over the framework should be to make the make it one, some kind of one knowledge, and also need to transfer and not only OECD members but also the emerging countries. Well, I talked in the first. We need to expand the stakeholders, but stakeholders not only industry but also the countries. We need to access to the emerging country also.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ohira-san. Christelle, comment knowledge gaps?
How can we say knowledge gaps? Okay, for knowledge gaps. If we have a general view which we've looked at, I'm trying not to give you a French view, but I'm trying to have a broader view. You could say that hydrogen is an energy vector. It's for transport, and you can import, export, sell and buy, and that's a good prospect because that's going to get us to low carbon and away from fossil energy. But what I think is interesting from my point of view, and to help the French hydrogen industry, I think what we need to do is to look at the cost of transportation and logistics. We say, okay, we're going to produce renewable electricity so that it's not expensive and so that there's a plentiful supply. Well, that's excellent. Okay, we want to produce it at a low price. But once, if you can produce a low-price hydrogen, and sometimes you'll have to transport it over thousands of kilometers, what will be the costs involved? Will it be shipped by sea? Are the ships there? You can ask the question for ammonia too. There's the question of logistics. You're going to have pipelines, maritime transport, and see what the cost is. And perhaps the corollary would be, I wrote this down when I was listening to Antoine. For countries outside the European Union where they might think that renewable hydrogen is the new El Dorado, perhaps we could look at the prospects of them exporting something which is not just hydrogen, but perhaps semi-processed products, because perhaps in Europe, where we want to be importing hydrogen, perhaps the ambition might be to have green hydrogen produced where it's not expensive, and then help us get to low carbon area. And how could this be changed for industry in these countries?
One important point is in these costs associated with transportation and logistics, we should also think about the cost associated with dependence or, over these global value chains. I mean, we've been talking a lot about, dependence to fossil fuel with the Russian war and so on, and, replacing this dependence with potentially another one is an important question, hence France's strategy to be self-sufficient in a sense, I guess. So I think this cost should also be taken into account, the dependence in the global value chains.
Yes, and energy security or whatever you want to call it, yes. Which is an entirely other discussion, but we have no time for that. Angel, can I ask you also about the knowledge gaps? What do you see as knowledge gap? What would you like to see more work on from OECD/IEA?
Yeah, I agree with the panelists. The cost is a key issue. We have to increase our R&D funds to decrease the cost of the electrolyzer, but not forget the cost of the renewable electricity. But also a common regulation and standards are two key issues to promote this new industry. But I don't want to forget that it is also an issue how we can find to share some experiences or best practices in some social acceptances of the projects. We have some large projects here in Chile, and we need to learn how to deal with these kind of experiences that maybe you can have in Europe, Japan, or other parts of the world.
Great. Thank you so much, Angel, for that addition. Last but not least, Timur.
Yeah, thanks
knowledge
a lot.
gaps.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think maybe just to quickly say on the supply chain issue, everyone who's interested should read our upcoming energy technology prospectus. So allow me my shameless advertising here, but it's coming out mid-January. It will deal with clean energy technology value chains. So
I agree.
He peer reviewed it, and so great. He agrees even publicly, so that's great. The two things I wanted to single out maybe on knowledge gaps is the way you design policy support schemes. I think is a very important question right now. There is a lot, especially on the production side, I must say. There is a lot to learn from past experiences in the renewable space, but also others. Nobody has an appetite for over-subsidization as at this point in time. So right-sizing policy schemes, what can we learn from other areas? Where did we do well? Where did we not so well? I think is a critical area that is, I wouldn't call it knowledge gap, but I think there is a strong need for precision here. The second is about market creation. I think it was already mentioned earlier. Obviously, low-emission hydrogen can tap into an existing market, if you want, which is those 94 million tons that are currently being produced and used in refining and in the chemical industry. But we are looking for new applications. So we are looking for new applications, how to scale them up, how to define the market rules, etc. Everything we've talked about today. So how to create a new market for new applications and bring supply, low-emission supply in contact with low-emission hydrogen demand, I think is a key area of work these days. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Timur. I will not try to summarize because time is up. I just ask you for one last round of applause for our excellent panel, including Angel online, please. Yes.
Well, thank you, speakers on this most excellent panel, and to the speakers on the many other excellent panels we've been listening to over the last day and a half. Thank you to participants, both online and in the room. The OECD Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum is our annual flagship conference, and it has two main objectives. The first is to bring together different communities of knowledge to stimulate multidisciplinary dialogue. This is a really key enabler for the transformative system-wide transformation we need to meet our net zero carbon objective. It's becoming increasingly clear that incremental, linear change won't get us there. We need, and we have less time than we think to do so. So in the past 2 days, your discussions involving experts from governments, representing different ministries and agencies, the private sector, academia, and other international organisations have been a really valuable input and a great listening exercise for us at the OECD. It's given us lots of food for thought and some promising dots to be connected. Now that leads to the second objective of the Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum, which is to identify knowledge gaps that could point to possible areas of future work. The GGSD Forum might finish technically today, but its work certainly doesn't. And we are going to take what we've learned about key knowledge gaps and feed this into our work under different OECD policy committees. And I think the discussion earlier this afternoon, which pointed out that there was an SME conversation going on in the very next room, is on digitalisation as a case in point. So I'm just going to try to sum up some key takeaway messages from the past 2 days and do that very quickly. First, a mission-oriented approach has the potential to accelerate green innovation, but we need to make net zero the mission, to mobilise the whole of society, governments, businesses and communities, and not just the science, technology and innovation community there. Second, bioeconomy policy has a goal to use bio-based technologies as replacements for fossil fuels. And this can also be a key enabler for the transition to a low-carbon and circular economy. It's really interesting to know that many countries have already introduced national bioeconomy strategies, so they're actively supporting what is a pretty novel industry, while at the same time addressing the possible trade-offs. We still need to address gaps, though, including around standards and certification, feedstock security, energy needs, and avoiding unintended consequences. Third, valuable lessons from the exceptionally rapid development and rollout of COVID-19 vaccines could be applied to green technologies. You know, with the pandemic, there was a palpable sense of dire emergency, even of panic, and we need this too, frankly, for net zero. Governments should therefore urgently support international cooperation on science and innovation, because doing it this way can help maximise benefits while also managing the costs and risks through sharing them. Fourth, supporting green innovation in SMEs means promoting the adoption of more sustainable production processes in existing firms and supporting green startups. SMEs need common, easily applicable sustainability standards. They need skills development as well as financing. And to avoid them feeling like they're drowning in compliance and obligations, we also need to look at the twin challenges of going green and going digital together for SMEs. Finally, back to this excellent panel. No one technology is a silver bullet for the net zero transition. Nevertheless, hydrogen is clearly likely to play an important role in the decarbonisation of several sectors, including some in the hard to abate, or as you put it, no, damn difficult category. But there are still a few significant barriers to overcome. To transform green hydrogen's potential into a reality, governments need to support applied research. We talked about electrolyser costs. We talked about the challenges of transporting green hydrogen as a fuel, for example. Governments need to invest in infrastructure, and they need to promote the development of sound regulations. So overall, I think this conference has provided us with a great deal of things to think about on what is needed to advance towards our ambitious green growth and sustainable development objectives. So thank you all for your participation today. Thank you especially to the panelists here and If Angel is still online in Chile, we really appreciated the enormous contribution you'd made to the discussion today. Thanks and good evening.